Tick tock, tick tock. It's Slick Podcast o'clock.
You have tuned in for a Slick Podcast. I'm here to seek the truth. Live from Scotland around the UK. The one and only Slick Podcast. Enjoy the show. Can I ask important questions? No matter how bizarre the truth might be. Tune in for Slick Podcast. Keeping it real, keeping it groovy.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, or a very good day to you when and wherever you're listening from. And a very warm welcome to the show. I'm your host, Simon Laurie King. Coming up on today's show, my guest is Martin Keller. Martin is a former pop culture journalist, published author and award-winning public relations pro, including an adventurous stint for Dr. Stephen Greer, founder of the organisation Centre for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence. Martin has interviewed big names in the music industry and moved in some influential circles with many big names from it. Music legends Bob Dylan, the late Prince, Paul McCartney, and the list goes on. He's been featured on many podcasts and radio broadcasts. His appearances include Coast to Coast AM, Today, 48 Hours, Hysteria 51, PBS Public Radio, and many more. Martin has written the book The Space Pen Club, which I've read and thoroughly enjoyed, and we'll be discussing in part here today. Martin's account of his own UFO experiences and subsequent time with Dr. Stephen Greer's organisation as public relations. His book, The Space Pen Club, is good-humoured and covers the journey from childhood, being awestruck by the early NASA missions, personal encounters of UFOs, and also travelling to Mexico as part of a rapid response team investigating a huge flurry of activity of unknown craft in the vicinity of Mount Popocatépetl, a slumbering volcano in southern Mexico. That's a very brief outline of Martin's great book, which just so happens also to have been endorsed by a well-known actor, Dan Aykroyd. So, let's get to it. I'm really looking forward to having this conversation today. So without further delay, it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Martin Keller to the show.
Hey, Simon. Happy to be here.
Let's get the ball rolling on this one. The subject of UFOs, or the current rebranded UAP'S, is huge and controversial. Start off, if you wouldn't mind, by telling us about the beginnings of your own interest in this phenomena that, as mentioned in the intro, led to you to write the book The Space Pen Club, a book which I've read and enjoyed, and moreover has been endorsed by the actor Dan Aykroyd, who himself has a huge interest in this subject. To note, this book is receiving very good reviews, and I'd personally recommend it to my listeners to read it if you have the opportunity. So let's open it that way, Martin.
Well, it all started in a remote part of the United States. I don't know how geographically smart your listeners are, but I grew up in western North Dakota, which borders Canada, and it's flanked by Montana and Minnesota. Minnesota's where I've lived for about the last 45 years in the Twin Cities, but the little town I grew up in is Dickinson, which my wife actually thought the surrounding farmlands reminded her of Scotland. But it's a remote area. I was a space nerd as a kid. I was fascinated by the early NASA space programs, Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo, and I wrote to NASA to get more information, and they sent these huge packets of information created for the public and for the press, probably primarily. And they included autographed photos of the astronauts. So I picked out some of my favorites, put them on my wall next to my Beatles, Stones, and Bob Dylan posters. And that said, I also had an interest in the UFO subject. I used to read the UFO magazines at the local drugstore until we got chased out of there. I had a sighting with 3 high school friends outside of our high school, very cold February night back in the late 60s. And it was an oval object, luminous, hovering over a University of North Dakota farm extension office about a quarter of a mile away. And it had been, that whole week there had been sightings reported in the press at that time, which basically out there consisted of, a handful of radio stations, a newspaper, and one or two TV stations. So there was an ongoing wave, if you will, of UFO sightings. And, we dashed outside during the middle of a high school basketball game to see this thing. And one of my friends said, let's get in my car and get closer to it. And I think I was the one who poo-pooed that idea. I'd like to have that one back again, but we were outside without our coats. We left them in the bleachers, and we went back in, and I really didn't think much about this topic once I went to college and began my early professional career as a journalist, a music journalist, covering pop culture here in the Twin Cities between the late 70s and early 90s, which was a pretty explosive time here. It was the ascendancy of Prince and a bunch of new wave alternative rock bands, a really great comedy scene. So it was a great gig, but I got tired of it. And in the early 90s, I returned to my interest in this subject, which is outlined pretty clearly in the book. I had some high strangeness events in my house and in my nightly dreaming, starting about 1990, 1991. And, the rest is on the pages of the Spaceman Club.
Are you still in contact with the friends and reminisce about that sighting that day?
One in particular, very much so, Jim, who is also referred to as Zod in the book. That was his nickname that our younger brothers gave him. And he's actually someone I've known since we were 5 years old as young kids. He's had a parallel interest in the subject, and he was my debate partner at one point, and now he's our family attorney. We compare notes on this on almost a regular basis.
Has he come up with a conclusion himself? Because we're going to move on to, obviously, SETI, Dr. Stephen Greer, but has he come up with a conclusion himself? I mean, is there any, no, we didn't see it and it must have been swamp gas, or is it what you thought it was? Obviously, it was unidentified, but has he changed his mind about actually seeing it?
He and I discussed this when I was writing the book, and I said, first I asked him to outline what he saw or what we saw, and then I did the same, and then we compared notes, and then we got together and had a discussion. And the only difference, and this is the, severity of time passing, I thought the object had structure and he thought it was more non-structural. So we tended to disagree on that. Sorry, I'm a barking dog in the distance. I don't know if it's picking up on Mike, but no, we're both fairly convinced this subject is real, that the Earth's been visited by one or more interstellar civilizations, surveilled, if you will, which is not to say there's not a lot of stuff out there that's mistaken for real spacecraft. I mean, there's a ton of misidentified stuff, and most of the stuff people see is not UFOs or ET craft or whatever you want to call them. But that said, we both agree that there's plenty of evidence, and you don't have to go far to find it. It's compelling and convincing.
Before we move on, did you have any missing time related to this incident?
No, it was pretty straightforward. I mean, we were outside without our winter coats on. It was 20 below zero, which is not uncommon for this part of the country. during the winter months, and we did not have any missing time. There's another incident in the book that I don't want to spoil it, that had happened earlier in the week that I had completely forgotten about until I was hypnotized in an Arizona desert during a CSETI skywatch and training. And that incident came up under hypnosis, which was very interesting. And we can leave it there for the moment.
Dr. Stephen Greer was a career medical doctor, obviously still a doctor, formerly an emergency room physician, but now retired these days from that. People would know him in his capacity as one of the main founders of SETI, the Center for Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence, and for his massive impact on bringing awareness to this subject, which I know that you have a lot to do with in the early years of SETI. Tell us about your relationship with Dr. Greer and the SETI group and what its remit would be.
Well, I just want to clarify, it's not SETI, it's CSETI. SETI is the other group of people, that organization that looks for radio signals in space. They send out radio signals and they try to scope across the universe to receive signals. They've been, they have a terrible record. I don't think they've done anything in the last, 30, 40 years since they've been around. But Dr. Greer's organization, a friend of mine, how I got involved with Dr. Greer, I came at it as a freelance journalist in the early 90s. A friend of mine had gone to an event he hosted in Wyoming, and they apparently had a couple of dramatic sightings during that event, and he was looking for someone to write about his research and talk about CSETI to obviously to get to a wider audience. And I was interested, like I said earlier, I hadn't really thought about that subject since high school, but Greer's whole thing was the Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind Initiative, CE5, and that's human initiated contact using lights, high-powered lights, although I think they use lasers now, and sound and remote viewing. And it was, I still look at it as one of the craziest things I've ever been involved in, but also one of the most fascinating. I wrote a 20-page story about him and his organization and some of the work they'd been doing, including in crop circle country in England at that time. And I couldn't get it published. I mean, the UFO subject has been so masterfully marginalized over, since the 40s, really. And there was no interest in it, unlike today, where it's a pretty hot subject in the news cycle. So I had been doing public relations work primarily as my profession at that point. And I told him, I said, look, I can keep trying to place this article, or I can help you with publicity. I said, I can probably get you greater visibility than with just one story that ends up in, Rolling Stone or Vanity Fair, the Atlantic Monthly, all, tier one major publications in this country. And he said yes, although he couldn't pay me to do the work. I had to do it pro bono. He did cover my travel expenses and, office type expenses, copies and things like that, long distance phone. And a good part of the Spacepan Club is based on our adventures that we had in the 90s. And there were some very interesting periods, including the first disclosure conference that he held in Washington in 97, which I was at. He's subsequently held two more. I attended the third one in June of this year. I did not go to the 2001 event, which was pretty big and got covered worldwide. But Greer's a very fascinating guy. He's very polarizing. He's highly controversial. He was something of a pariah when I met him, and nobody knew who he was. And fast forward 35 years, and he is even more of a pariah these days. He's outspoken, but I trust most of what he's brought to the public, to the town square, if you will, although I often disagree with some of the ways he frames it. But that said, CSETI has become one of the, and Dr. Greer himself has become one of the experts in the field.
So using lights, or as now using lasers, is this, in your opinion, to initiate first contact, and when that happens or has happened, or an object was suddenly to land and I'm paraphrasing probably a really bad way as well, came out, are there set ways of doing in their remit of contact with these craft or their occupants?
Yeah, I mean, he's got the contact protocols. He also has protocols for a landing event, of which there have been several in different parts of the world, including Mexico. There's a whole chapter on CSETI in Mexico in the 90s. I went on one of those excursions. Unfortunately, we were shadowed by a news crew from CBS News and their program called 48 Hours. And they made us look like village idiots. There was no context to why we were there. And why we were there is that in the early 90s, there was a spectacular UFO wave with a total eclipse. And during the eclipse, these unidentified flying objects started appearing everywhere, over huge metropolitan areas like Mexico City, and then out in rural areas among the campesinos. And lots of video was shot. And at some point, we dispatched our, what they're called, rapid mobilization investigative team, RMIT, to these areas. And we went primarily to the volcano zone, which is only about 80 miles near Mexico City. It's a quick bus ride. And if you want to see unidentified flying objects, UAP, whatever you want to call it, the volcano zone is a pretty active place even yet today. There's a webcam train down Mount Popo, which is I think the third largest active volcano in the world. And there's a lot of objects coming and going around and into and out of that volcano. It's kind of mind blowing.
If I'm right in saying, without revealing too much, the meaningful footage, the cameramen weren't really on the ball, but the meaningful footage was conveniently left out of the 48 hours production, and out of all of the material that you guys had kindly let them in on, as it were, they used very little. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, it is and it isn't. It's strange because the talent, Harold Dow, who was a African-American reporter with CBS, with that CBS show, he and his producer's car broke down about 40 miles away, and were not able to make it out the first night. And the first night is when we had a really close sighting of a craft that we interacted with our high-powered spotlight. And we were with the cameraman and videographer they had hired from Los Angeles. They were with us that night, and they shot the whole thing. And it's weird because they used that image of this object coming through the sky and us signaling it, and the object signaling back to us They used it to open our segment of that program. They were doing a special on UFOs, like the broadcast networks will do from time to time, because it gets good ratings. And but they never provided any context for it, for that footage that opened the spot. I provide plenty of it in the I think it's chapter 8 in the book. Why we were there, what's been happening in Mexico, and why we were shooting a high-powered spotlight, if you will, at this object. But the object signaled back at us twice, as Dr. Greer signaled to it from where we were on this hillside. It was a thrilling moment, and then the object went beneath the horizon. And it was only maybe, I would say, 3 to 5 miles away. It's hard to estimate at night, but it was relatively close. It seemed to have a dome on it, but the dome was translucent. You could almost see right through it. And it seemed like the object went into the ground, because we weren't up that high, and that whole valley around the volcano is relatively low level. Volcano itself is around 10,000 some feet.
So the report lacked content, or context, should I say. Yeah, okay. I'm a night worker, as I talked to you before the beginning of the show. So to reset my body clock, after my days off, I get up at 2:00 in the morning and wait up till around 8:30, then go back to bed until it's afternoon, ready to start my week. That was the long way round, but I needed to set the scene. So then, one morning I was scrolling through YouTube and I came across a live United States congressional hearing on the subject of UAPs. And in attendance were former Navy pilot Commander David Fravor, former fighter pilot Ryan Graves, and retired Major David Grush. I hope I'm saying his name right, formerly part of the government's own UAP task force. After I realized this was legitimate and not a group of enthusiasts with a great backdrop somewhere near Roswell, I paid very close attention to this amazing piece of historical testimony. Martin, give us some idea as to what led to this hearing by Congress and to the witnesses coming forward. And I will add as well, there was a lot of what was said asked wasn't willing to be answered until a secure room was had. Yeah. Could you if you could touch on that, please? Thank you.
Yeah, that congressional hearing, which took place July 26th of this year, was kind of a mind blower as well. I mean, people who've been interested in their subject their whole life, like me and Danny Aykroyd, and thousands of other people around the world, millions of other people around the world, we never expected to hear somebody like David Grush, whose credentials are impeccable. And he came forth as a whistleblower. And there's a new law that's been in effect for almost a year, a national law that's written into the Defense Authorization Act of 2022 or 23, I guess, because it's for the coming year. And it was passed and signed into law late last year in December. There's a clause that was written into that language, which funds the Defense Department, into that bill, and it protects whistleblowers like Grush and others who are starting to come forward. Quite a few of these guys have met behind closed doors in classified sessions. Grush, of course, has been very public, and he came right out during that hearing and said, we have biologics and down craft. Now, biologics is just military jargon. It's shorthand for biological entities of these occupants. And he was asked by a couple of different Congress persons, including Congressman Mace, who is from South Carolina. And she said, well, where are these biologics and craft? If they're in our possession, where could we find out where they are? And he said, well, I can't tell you publicly, but I can tell you, after the hearing, I can give you a list of locations, and I can also give you a list of hostile and friendly witnesses who will collaborate my testimony. That's basically what Grush told her. I mean, this is nationally broadcast. You can find it as you did on YouTube. I think it's probably also on C-SPAN. There's lots of news coverage of it. There's lots of memes floating around on the interwebs that are somewhat humorous. How did we get to this point? Well, in 2017, the New York Times made it safe to do serious reporting on this subject by reporting on a top secret Pentagon study that had taken place in the early 2000s, I think 2007 to 2010, and then the funding ran out for it. But three intrepid reporters got the story, convinced their editor. Two were freelance writers. One was a military reporter for the Times, staff reporter, convinced their editor that their sources were solid, and it ended up on the front page of the New York Times. And the story never once mentioned the verbiage conspiracy or conspiracy theorists. It was very straightforward, and it pretty much legitimatized other news organizations to do similar stories, and it kind of opened the floodgates. So, we're coming up on 6 years since that happened, but it was a really dramatic sea change, and none of us really expected things to progress this far, especially with the hearings in Washington, although there's lots of pushback now behind closed doors. There's a lot of elements within, or some elements within, the Washington military industrial matrix who never want this subject to come out for various reasons. But it's an interesting time to be aware of this topic.
It's good to hear that modern journalism is taking this seriously and not mocking it. For professional people, pilots, ex-pilots, they are trained observers. We can't just sign on a line and get a job as a pilot. These people a lot of them hold degrees. They're physically fit, mentally fit. And it's incredible. But for people like that to come forward, military people, credible witnesses, to sit in front of Congress and to start talking about this, do you think this will end up, or the initial interview, the initial hearings, will it end up with a meaningful conclusion, or, as you were maybe suggesting, and I'll add on, do you think it will be just swept away? Before we move on.
Well, that's a great question, and I don't know that I have the answer or if anyone else has the answers, but we've come a long way in a short period of time. The cat's out of the bag, to use an old cliche. Do people care? I don't know. I think people say, great, aliens exist. Flying saucers are real. What's in it for me? I still have to go to work. I still have to pay my mortgage. I still have to pay my daycare, shop for groceries, get the oil changed on the car, blah, blah, blah. Is it moving the needle publicly? I don't know. I mean, with Greer's organization, which is very grassroots, and the history of ufology is full of grassroots organizations, not unlike SETI, that have pushed for the truth to come out over the years. There's alphabet soup of list of these organizations, NICAP, and on and on. I don't know what's next. I wish I did. Personally, I have grown weary of the topic. I don't even look at UFO videos that are posted anymore. I try not to read too many opinion pieces about it on Twitter or elsewhere. I've just been waiting for so long as an observer of this phenomenon, but also an experiencer of high strangeness, which may or may not be related to the topic. That's one of the themes in my book. Well, these weird things that happened to me personally in my home, were they related to the ET subject? Were they abductions? I mean, there's a whole chapter in the Space Pen Club about abductions, chapter 3. I'm telling you, if you can get through chapter 3, it's smooth sailing in the rest of the book, because the whole abduction issue is very murky. It's very dark. There's a lot of different scenarios that seem to be true about it, including the fact that, some of these abduction experiences people have claimed can actually be or were done by military psyops, black psyop teams. And that's, I think, more disturbing than the fact that, we might be getting visitors from Alpha Centauri surveilling us. I mean, it's really nefarious stuff, and it's a complex subject. So where do we go from here? I don't know. It's a TBD or TBC, to be continued.
We will be right back.
Watch this.
Please keep them kind.
Yeah,
Cheers.
It's a slick podcast and we keeping it real. We keeping it groovy. Here's the food for your thoughts, so you know we ain't losing. We just trying to hit the top. Every topic you choosing, simulate the mind frame. We just helping you use it. Feel it's a slick podcast. Thanks for tuning in, cause we're here to see the truth. Yeah, we doing it. Life in Scotland, around the UK. Question what do you say? No matter how bizarre, we answer it. Yeah, it's the new way. Slick podcast, come enjoy the show. Keep it real, keep it groovy. Always how we roll. This is passion. Podcast, this is passion.
Please keep them kind. Cheers.
The Sleep Podcast. The Sleep Podcast. Yeah, it's a Sleep Podcast. Truly unforgettable topic. This is Sleep Podcast.
I agree with what you're saying about being not really verbatim, but paraphrasing, that being weary of the subject. I have that feeling also. Let me give you an analogy, if you wouldn't mind, Martin. Let's say you were coming to my house, but for a week I told you what we're having for dinner and kept on and on and on and on. Then when you came round, I kept going on, and you'd be like, yeah, okay, we'll just serve the dinner then. That's the way it is for me. However, I see this as, I'm hoping, will move everything forward. Now, there will be people that are scared and suddenly having their bubble burst, thinking there are other sentient life in the universe. I've watched the hearings, like I have, and I've also seen videos. I can't handle this, so I'm just going to put my head in the sand. And that will include people in power and people who, like myself, just work an honest job across the board. But like yourself, yes, I am as well. The same as ancient archaeology. I like that as well. But until something new comes up, something meaningful, a step forward, we're just going round and round in circles. So I've seen UAP'S footage of it allegedly taken by combat pilots, and the craft they are filming display incredible capabilities that seem way out of the reach of the observational aircraft. This was also confirmed by former US pilots Fravor and Graves. In your opinion, Martin, before we move on, should we be worried? FYI, I certainly am, or at least very concerned.
I don't think I'm as concerned as you appear to be, Simon. I think, number one, some of these things that are being reported by the pilots, I think, are actually ours. I get into that, and I'm blogging at my book's website, thespacepenclub.com. I've written a couple blogs about that related to this very issue, and then the third disclosure event that Dr. Greer presented in Washington last June. An associate of his, Dr. Michael, I'm going to blank on his name, but his name is in the blog. He's a academic. His specialty is historical technology as it relates to the military. So he's done quite a bit of his homework, and he presented a really strong case for a lot of these objects being manufactured here. And they're obviously above top secret with lots of, amazing capabilities, as you just described. I think the statistic he shared during the event was that 90% of the stuff that is seen globally is man-made, is terrestrial in nature, devised by major corporations who are under contract with national governments, and tons of secrecy around them, obviously, and only 10% are probably the real thing coming from interstellar space. But am I concerned? I don't know. I don't think we're going to be invaded anytime soon. I mean, I think there doesn't seem to be any hostile intentions on the part of these visitors, and but I could be proven wrong tomorrow night.
Well, when we have things like cattle mutilations and alleged abductions, and really these craft seemingly being able to outmaneuver the highest end technology that we can offer, that's why I'm concerned, and also that nobody really has a handle of what these things are. Just before we move on, what is C. SETI's opinion on these things? Is it all of the above? It could be terrestrial or extraterrestrial, or all of the above. Fill in the blank.
Well, I think Greer's made pretty clear over the last 30 years that these are visiting ET craft, and that we do, yes, in fact, have our own that have been reverse engineered. He says there's a net non-hostile intention on their part. He thinks a lot of the cases, the close encounter cases of the fourth kind, which is interaction with these beings, I mean, the message is always, your nuclear weapons are a threat to the planet, the environment, but also to us traveling through space. You need to clean up your environment, and you need to, stop warring in case, there would be a nuclear exchange. And that's the C. SETI position. It might be viewed as what's the word here? Pollyanna, I guess. It might be viewed as an uninformed opinion, but I tend to embrace it personally. And looking at the evidence, I don't think there's a threat. I think the threat is us.
Sticking on that same theme then, a good friend of this podcast and this show's very first interview, in fact, is Jared Murphy. Jared wrote a book called It's Not Aliens, Worse, It's Us. In this book, Jared touches on many subjects of ancient architecture and manufactured soil known as terra preta and so on. He also suggests that we should not dismiss the possibility that the UFOs that we see in the past could be us. Not so much as in time travelers, although he doesn't dismiss the idea, but as a breakaway presence of human society that maybe are the survivors from the many cataclysms that have been fallen humanity. Jared's book, It's Not Aliens, Worse, It's Us, is definitely worth a read. So we're talking about a parallel society that's always been here.
I have heard that theory. Again, it's almost as hard to believe as the one that, we have visiting spaceships and other beings interacting with people on planet Earth. I find it fascinating, actually, that there could be a breakaway civilization. A good friend of mine who has done some really outstanding research on different cases over the years, his name is Tom Talene. He lives here in Minneapolis, not too far from me, actually, and he did a wonderful deep dive on the Minot Air Force Base incursion in 1968, October of 68, in which a large object shut down the launch system on a atomic silo. Minot is about 100 miles from where I grew up out in Dickinson, North Dakota, far western North Dakota. And Tom's done years of research. He's read all the books. He knows all the reputable players, including Jacques Vallée, the Frenchman who was, of course, famously featured in the Close Encounters of the Third Kind film by Spielberg back in the mid-70s. Tom's done all this research, including the Minot case, which you can find online. Just Google Minot 68 Air Force Base, UFOs, Tom Talene, any of those words will take you to the site. You can read the whole report he's done. It's very thorough. It's got a ton of footnotes. Tom, at one point, not too long ago, decided that all this stuff was terrestrial. None of it was extraterrestrial. And it kind of he said, it put me in a 3-month depression. And when I realized, like, oh my God, this is all our stuff. This is all like belongs to some secret elite civilization that, is operating in plain sight that no one understands. So, it's a viable theory. I mean, I'm an English major. I love stories. I love storytelling. And, if anyone that's interested in, science fiction or science fact or fantasy, the UFO subject provides so many tempting narratives, tempting storylines that you can literally spend your life, traversing those lines.
When I think about Jared's hypothesis, and I've read his book, I'm always reminded of the old book. I'm trying to think when it was written, maybe back in the 50s, called The Smoking God. Now, I'm not going into people living and there's a hole in the North Pole. I really, I don't have the time or the brain space for that. Are you familiar with that book, though, The Smoking God? Because that is a really good book to read.
I don't think I am, but I am very familiar with the North Pole, Admiral Byrd excursions to the poles and the lost civilization under the ice that includes flying saucers and tropical environments. I mean, it invariably gets wrapped up with the Nazi interest, the German interest in UFOs and propulsion and all that stuff. And I mean, like I said just a couple minutes ago, there's so many storylines on this. There's so many tributaries. I don't know. You have to try to be discerning, I guess, and find the one that you want to embrace, or keep an open mind, or just shut the whole thing down.
Yeah, the open mind thing, that's probably the best way to be. Maybe have an opinion on it or don't have an opinion on it, which is the same as the questions that I've asked or may ask you, and you say, I don't really have an opinion on that. I'm okay with it. We can move on. I can't, if people talk about this subject, I really like talking about it. I like talking about it. Maybe nothing about 1947. Although if that happened in Roswell, that is obviously a big moment. But in my opinion, we've done that. We've done that to death. We need something new. But as far as the North Pole and the breakaway civilizations and this, that, and the other, I can only have an opinion on so many of them. I'm just watching and waiting. And it's just the bizarreness of the mainstream media and the American government. I don't really hear a lot from the British government on this subject, are taking this seriously, or at least it looks like they are. So let's just move on then. So here's the question that a lot of people ask. And again, if you haven't got an opinion, not a problem. Here's the question that a lot of people ask, and I've never heard a satisfactory answer to. This world is racked in so much darkness right now. I could run through a list of things like war, hunger, corruption, depravity, etc. I don't need to go through the whole list as I do this anyway. It tends to irk me. In your opinion, then, why can't these guys, if they're real, breakaway civilization or whatever, from our skies, interject on this world and save us a lot of trouble and give a long overdue growth spurt. Usually among the convenient, unapprovable answers are, I hear it's either a degree from some astral space federation, which makes me kind of get a little bit of vomit in the back of my throat, of worlds, and our governments, which is, this is the opinion, you can't interfere, it's an agreement, or it's that sweet old cookie knows we should come together and change as a people and harmonize in our world. Again, this is easy to say and obvious, but when you average person is getting less and less empowered by society's leadership, it would take a miraculous change in our psyche to instigate instigate the change and change the way things currently are. Do you have an opinion about that? If there was a breakaway civilization, if there is some sort of interstellar, I don't know, civilization, why don't they just come down and fix some stuff?
Well, again, that's a great question, and people have been asking it forever since, this became a real subject, mostly with the advent of the atomic age on the planet. I think, this is pure conjecture on my part. In the book, I ask, why are we in this apparent sudden disclosure period that we find ourselves in with these hearings, with this front page New York Times story. And in the book, I just say, well, look, maybe it's as simple as we've been given a signal by whoever is visiting that we need to make this a reality. That said, I think the counterpoint to that in that thought expressed in my book is that these visitors need to take an initiative. They need to make themselves known in a large-scale global event of some kind. And will that ever happen? I don't know. I mean, there's so many theories as to why it never will. I know a lot of people believe that there truly is a what's that expression from Star Trek? A prime directive that you can't interfere with another planet's operation or life cycle. You can't intervene. You have to, surveil and do very minor interacting with any one planetary civilization. It sounds good on paper, I guess. Breakaway civilization, I would think, and this is something Greer's been pounding on for the last couple of years, is that these are probably, if there is such an organization, and he thinks there is, that there's these tightly knit intergovernmental corporate alliances that have captured this energy that could wipe out the need for fossil fuels, which are choking us and the planet as we speak. They have locked up these technologies, and these are criminal enterprises. It's very strident, but it's also very Steve Greer. And he's going to try to prosecute it. He's got a whole team of pro bono lawyers lined up to try to bring this subject further out into the public square and into the courtroom. So that's going to be interesting to watch. It might even rejuvenate my interest in this subject should they make any headway. It's a huge David and Goliath problem, a scenario. So
would you agree with it? Would you agree with the analogy? The whole subject, really, I felt it really important to address this subject, if not to get it out of my system. And I think it's a very important subject to talk about. But would you agree with the analogy? It's like a wasp in a jar. It's moving, but it's not going anywhere. It's not really heading anywhere meaningful. And something needs to happen drastically because, again, people are becoming complacent about it. They've got so many shiny things to distract them. The latest iPhone, the latest fashion, blah, 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 fill in the blank. It needs something meaningful to happen. And in fact, by keeping that wasp in a jar is keeping people's eye on that and taking them away from the incredible impact if something did move forward. What do you say about that?
The sentiments expressed at the congressional hearing in July are the sentiments that the public holds. Show us the biologics, show us the cadavers. Maybe they're not cadavers. Maybe Some are being held in high security systems. Show us the down spacecraft. Let's find out where they're from. Let's find out what they want, if they want anything. Let's find out what role humanity might play in this revelation, should it ever come to the fore in the way in which it needs to. That's kind of where I am right now.
I think on the other side of the card as well, maybe being one of the visitors myself, let's put myself in their position. If the human species, which are exactly the same genetically as each other, regardless of culture or creed, they're exactly the same. If they can't get on with each other because it's about territory, it's about religion, it's about the way what you have and what you haven't got, what chance have I got to go down on that planet and not be hated, not have war raised upon me? It's almost like a species we're pushing them away. And now I'm assuming that they are real and they are watching us. So I wouldn't really want to come down onto the planet when they can't live with each other, let alone me, and I've got nothing to relate to them. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that's a great perspective, and I think it's a telling perspective. I've read these accounts over the years where, Earth has been identified as a beautiful planet, but it's so hostile. The inhabitants are so unevolved that the Earth has to be quarantined until the time where they can be welcomed into the Galactic Federation. It's another term I've heard tossed around by some very smart, highly educated, highly public people like Attorney Danny Sheehan, who was involved with Dr. Greer's organization for years. In fact, there's a story about Dan, how I recruited him at a UFO conference in Nevada one year because he sounded like Stephen Greer during his lecture, and I got him involved in our disclosure efforts. Dan's been in, he's fairly famous. He helped litigate the Pentagon Papers, the Karen Silkwood case, Iran-Contra. I mean, he's been kind of one of my heroes in the legal world. And I was shocked, actually, when I found out he has a lifelong interest in this. And he wrote a white paper for Jimmy Carter at Carter's request. He's well connected with the Vatican. He knows the Vatican has a huge secret library on this that no one will let him into, although they will acknowledge its presence. And, Dan says Galactic Federation with a straight face. I still kind of say it with a smile on my face, because I have no proof of it, but I hear it referred to time and again. But this is a dangerous planet. You have to tread very carefully if you're going to try to interact with the people. And who do you interact with? The government leaders or the man or woman on the street? Most of these close encounter cases of the third and fourth kind, they're with people out in rural areas, occasionally over in cities, but they're not knocking on the door of the White House, at least not that we're aware of.
Well, I'm very glad of that. Nothing to do really with the White House, but everything to do with the White House and number 10 Downing Street and every platform of leadership. I'm very glad that they're not. I would say that if it was up to me, I would make a worldwide presence, not as in Hollywood, hanging above New York City, looking intimidating, but something very close to communication with everybody, all the aforementioned and everybody else. Here's a choice. Here's a choice. We're here. And I think that if there is a Galactic Federation, they're doing a really, really poor job, because there's a lot of suffering on the planet. I'm not getting out the smallest violin in the world. It just happens to be a fact. As a species, and I've said this before on my show and probably say it nearly every single week, as a species, we should be so much more than we are today. Now, you're young enough to remember that before mobile phones came out, and then suddenly we had mobile phones, and now we have handheld computers that happen to have a phone app on it. We understand technology, and the last 3 years and all of the high strangeness, we understand weirdness as well. And I think we should be given a chance. And if there is such a thing as the either breakaway civilization or some civilization that has a handle on space travel and can make life so much better, they are obligated, as far as humanity goes, to give them the opportunity to better themselves. Because if somebody wears the badge of office, it doesn't make them an authority of what's best for the people. Before we move on, what do you have to say about that?
Well, I think that's a really well-reasoned statement. I think, these visitors, whoever or whatever they are, would have a lot to offer the planet if we could get beyond ourselves. I want to read quickly something from Dan Aykroyd's endorsement of the book, because he addresses the same topic in the same vein. Dan writes, "The Space Bank Club is an essential read for anyone interested in getting to the truth about one of the greatest mysteries and enigmas in our existence. Who owns these hyper-advanced off-world aerodynamic platforms? Who controls their obviously intelligent non-human operators? And if these things are known to anyone, why can't the technology be shared now? The mechanisms and fuel sources in these crafts could help save our planet and provide basic needs for millions: power, clean water, and climate temperance." Now that's, to me, sums up exactly where this argument needs to be.
I agree, but what I see, Martin, is what I see every single day, away from the UFO subject, but including it also, if that isn't an oxymoron. There is no profit in doing the right thing. And I can't see anything else. No other reason. There's no profit in doing the right thing, which points to maybe 99.9% are terrestrial and maybe 1% extraterrestrial. But to know humanity is to not stand from afar and observe, because the actions of the wicked do not reflect your average good person. It certainly doesn't reflect my good morals and scruples. And if you're listening, you need to come down and give account of yourself, because there are people who are innocent and have a terrible time on this planet because of the wicked. So again, I'll just say that there is no profit in doing the right thing, which is why we don't have free energy, why America and other countries don't have a free health system, why there's still war raging, blah, 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 fill in the blank. And I think it's as simple as that. There's just no profit in doing the right thing. What do you think?
Yeah, sadly and cynically, I think you're right. Nice guys.
If I've crossed the line, tell me.
I totally agree with you. I'm a big Bob Dylan fan, and Dylan has said some really profound things over the years, obviously through his songs, but also in rare public interviews. And I was lucky enough to interview him in 1983 when Infidels came out. This was right after his so-called conversion to Christianity, his born again period. And in conversation with him, he reminded me a couple of times that the Bible says that Satan rules the world. It's like, whoa, we're going there? I'm not sure what the biblical reference or footnote is on that, but it's always stuck with me. And I mean, you don't have to look far to find wickedness as you describe it. And at this point, if the world's population just had enough clean water and food, that would be huge forward progress versus developing the next line of super hypersonic bombs to destroy us. It's an old story.
Well, okay then. Am I being cynical and am I being unfair? Let's just talk about some of the three major companies. I believe it's three, certainly two, wanting to take humanity into space. I personally think it's ridiculous, not as in the idea of it, but it's in the front, to be honest with you. Again, because there's so much suffering on this planet, why would you take humanity into space and inequality into space and beyond. I think that we are really missing, and that might be keeping some civilizations. We're spending millions of dollars or pounds or euros on things that won't benefit your average human now. I'm not interested. It's probably unfair of me in generations to come. Yes, I wish them luck. Of course I do. But it's my time as well, right now, right here. And I think it's a waste of money taking humanity into space when we haven't cleaned our own house. What do you think about that?
Well, it's an interesting image. I mean, it's like here we go into space to try to colonize Mars with all of our inherent deadly human viruses, if you will, human defects.
Prejudices and things like that. You know, we need to get ourselves sorted out, right?
Exactly. I just think it's, there's these organizations, these individuals like Bezos and what's his name? The guy at Virgin Atlantic.
Richard Branson, and then you've got Elon Musk as well.
And Musk.
Yeah.
They have the means now to do this exploratory space venture. They can do what they want with their money. Is it going to benefit us in the short or long term? Probably not. In the long term, I think that's remains to be seen. I mean, I don't think the prospect of colonizing Mars is all that realistic, and why would you want to? I mean, this is a beautiful planet. Let's take care of it. Let's dump our resources into environmental upgrades rather than degradations, and let's save what we have. Let's get off fossil fuels.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. We should be we should be so much more as we are today as a species. We really should. We've got everything going for us. And we show all the shiny things and what we've achieved, with iPhones and this, that, and the other. But around the world, there are so many people suffering, not clean water or homes or through needless war, needless war. Apart from it's good for profit. Is that the cynical part of me? No, it's a fact. But we should clean our own house first. So let's just move on. Last couple of questions before we wrap up. I would like to talk about abductions. As far as one of the best known was, let's have a look. One of the best known cases of alien interaction as far as media exposure goes has to be the 1975 abduction of forest worker Travis Walton. There are thousands who claim that they have been taken by unknown forces to places to be examined, poked and prodded. Now, some of them probably like yourself, I want to just bang my head against the wall. They're talking about star children. No time for that. But some of them are really quite violent, and the people have been affected almost in post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, you did touch, Martin, earlier on about it could be us. It could be military. Again, that could be concerning. What do you have to say about that?
I think the Travis Walton case is pretty solid. The movie takes a lot of liberties with the ET storyline. Walton, I think in the book, claims that they were helpful to him once they had him on board. They weren't nefarious. They weren't diabolical, and they Hollywoodized it up a bit. And I've noticed of late, just cruising through some of the stuff on the internet, that the Walton case seems to be back in the public's mind again. I'm not sure why, but there's been a lot of pushback, like, no, this story is all BS. The whole abduction thing is a really deep rabbit hole, and I think personally that when this subject, if it progresses through the Congress in any fashion, at some point somebody's going to play the abduction card, and everyone's going to throw up their arms, because we've been so conditioned to, like, this is either pure nonsense or it's real, and there's no way to stop it. There's no way to put a jar around it. It's I wrote a blog about this a year ago on the spacepenclub.com, that talks about it as being a kind of scarlet letter, A for abduction. It's once this gets into the current discussion, I just think it's going to shut down a lot more people than need to be closed off from this at some point. But it's an unknown. It's a true X. It's a true unknown.
Are you familiar with the ex-Navy SEAL Sean Ryan? He's on YouTube. He's got his own podcast.
Not sure I am.
Okay, I'll find the link and I'll send it to you after we conclude our interview. But Sean interviewed a Marine, and I'm sure he'd been on part of the relief effort, this Marine, US Marine, with his comrades. It's maybe Haiti or something like that. But there was an American relief effort. And Sean was talking.
Yeah.
Do you want to pick that story up? Do you want to pick that story up, please? Thank you.
This guy was actually at the disclosure event in Washington that I went to in June. And I wrote a blog about that too. In fact, I think that was my last substantial blog I've written on that site. They were on a relief mission, and somewhere was it Indonesia, right around the earthquake and tsunami event. And they came upon a craft that seemed to be hovering. And there were a bunch of guys also in military dress, but with no identifying insignias on their uniforms, unlike the guys that kind of stumbled upon them. And these guys, Michael Herrera, I think is his name. It's his story, and he said that he thought they were going to be killed by these guys because they obviously wrong place, wrong time. They were marched out of there, and they could see that something was being loaded onto this hovering craft, obviously man-made or probably man-made. And then the next day, Herrera was called in by a commanding officer who again had no identifiable insignias on his uniform, which, if it were me, I would just refuse to even meet with such an individual, because probably there's consequences for that, obviously. But this guy basically told him, you're never going to talk about this event. Forget about it. Tell your guys to forget about it. But Herrera was emboldened to come forward, given the whistleblower protections now, the legal laws that exist in the U.S. around the subject, to talk about it. And he talked about it in very gripping detail. It's kind of a horrific story. And apparently he's had, subsequent harassment for going public with it at this event, which is par for the course. I mean, to me,
he was suggesting as well, or maybe Sean was, or both of them, but the subject certainly came up of taking people. They were loading containers, but taking people. But the U.S. Marine, your average U.S. Marine, is very well trained, extremely well trained.
Right.
I'm guessing maybe these guys were veterans of maybe Afghanistan or Iraq, but regardless of that, they were very well trained, fully armed. Yet they come across this craft, and all of them were disarmed. They were almost ambushed by these people in uniform, again, highly trained, fully armed. And these well-trained US Marines were basically jumped, and they were disarmed, all of them, just like that, by a group of people with no insignias, by this high-tech craft. That's worrying.
Yeah, it's worrisome as hell, and it's obviously probably an illegal enterprise. The Herrera suggested there was human trafficking involved. There was drugs and arms smuggling involved. It's nasty business, and it's the kind of thing that Greer and his group of lawyers, with Dan Sheehan advising them, are going to try to get to the bottom of it, and hopefully no one gets killed for it.
Yeah, that's the big one, isn't it? That's us at the top of the hour, Martin. I've really appreciated the time you've given us today. Before you go, please tell my listeners where they can reach out to you and find you online, and where they can purchase your book. And of course, any and all upcoming events. And if you could leave us with some thoughts of hope to maybe conclude this subject, some words of inspiration, maybe.
Well, I try to remain optimistic, but some days it's almost impossible. But I think you have to be. I think we're optimistic creatures at our core. We're light beings, if we truly want to admit it. Where you can get my book, Amazon is probably your best bet. And you can interact with me in a couple of different places. Like I said, I have the blog on the book's website, which is www.thespacepenclub.com. There's also a small but growing Facebook group page for the Space Pen Club. Easy to find. A lot of folks are posting news stories or commentary, stuff like that, on there on a fairly regular basis. You can join that group. I've let just about everybody in that's applied, except for some obvious bots. But you can also email me through the publishing house, and that email is, I have to look it up, spacepenclub@calumeteditions.com. spacepenclub@calumeteditions.com, and they will forward any and all emails that I get from the public. So that's it. If you do buy the book on Amazon, I greatly appreciate you writing a review of it, even if you don't like it, because the more reviews that are placed under a book on Amazon, it tickles the algorithm. It makes the book come up in search more often. So the world we live in. Anyway, happy trails, if nothing else.
Martin Keller, thank you.
Thank you, Simon.
And that was the Martin Keller interview. A really good conversation, if you don't mind me saying so, and one that I'm really grateful to have had with Martin. The subject of UFOs, or as previously stated by me, the rebranded UAP, is something I've always paid attention to, an itch that just can't be scratched. During our conversation day, I said that I was very concerned about these happenings. Concerned because there is enough going on in our world already to push humanity over the edge into complete chaos. Nothing else needed to throw world society into a really dark place. War and or talk of war, to mention but one. To say nothing of potential malevolent spacefaring conquistadors waiting for an opportune moment to ingress into our society. These are really strange times that we live in, and as I said, worrying also. Whether these craft are visitors from afar or versed engineered, we the people have a right to know. I personally don't think that governments or religious, air quotes, leaders have any grounds for holding us back. And what is the stance on the UFO flurry currently by, air quotes, religious leaders? In fact, how about the whole constant war footing that seems to be a thing these days by any of the aforementioned? Demanding peace in the name of the Creator's love should be the thing. Just saying. So after this interview, I decided to address a few lines to any visitors from outside our planet. If the Galactic Federation have to be tuned into this show, perhaps because as I see it, our current status, absolutely in my opinion, doesn't reflect the average person just trying to get by, regardless of where they be. So here are those few lines. Dear visitors, first of all, welcome to the planet we call Earth. It is, of the utmost importance, I ask you to realise the planet you now observe and the species that seem predominant is governed in the most part by those who have no understanding of where our potential should have led us by now. I therefore ask you to take into account the human species would choose above all to live in peace if freed from the unnecessary bondage that now binds and retards its people. Our planet has been taken over by hostile forces and its inhabitants enslaved and divided by murderous lies and subterfuge of the many ages that have passed. Our full potential now resides incarcerated, seemingly never to see the light of day. I can assure you, however, there are billions of our race who would embrace the truth. We are not alone in the great expanse that we know as the universe. The unseen dark ruling governance of our home world are few in number, but hold dominion over all. They are cunning and extremely dangerous, and I ask you to be on your guard, for they cannot be trusted. Lastly, these heinous actions of the few in no way reflects or represents our race, or the goodness that by our very nature is inherent in us all. Therefore, before any judgment is concluded or complete annihilation for the inhabitants of this world you now observe is passed forth, please take these words into account. My kindest regards, the Slick Podcast. So, if you are a member of the Great Council of Star People looking down upon us, take those words into consideration, or feel free to send the show a response. Hell, come on for a conversation if you'd rather. Either way would work. I think we as a species need to think of the bigger picture here about this obvious happening, not what we could get out of it individually, but what we as a world could gain. Again, I'd like to thank Martin for his time today. It was a great conversation, an absolute pleasure to talk to him. And my thanks to you also, my dear listeners, for attending this cast. You can find Martin's website by clicking on the link below. I've also put a link to the Sean Ryan podcast when he interviewed former US Marine Michael Herrera. This is the episode I mentioned to Martin earlier and we discussed briefly. Absolutely worth a listen to. If you enjoyed the episode, give it a like or leave a comment below. Subscribe also if you'd be so kind. Or send the show an email, theslkpodcast@gmail.com. But either way, please, keep them kind. I've decided to leave Facebook and will be moving this show to a new platform that is also going to be the subject of one of my next interviews with its founder. You can find the Simon Laurie King podcast on YouTube and all the usual podcast catchers. And so, my friends, it's time for me to go. Until next time, stay safe, be happy, and certainly not afraid. Bye.
Slick Podcast. Keeping it real. And always keeping it groovy.